Everything we know about ecology tells us that the key to preserving biodiversity is protecting large areas of connected habitat. And the Yukon South Beringia project will help us identify some of these areas that need special management.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Conor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada. We're going to be doing something a bit different on today's podcast. We're going to be featuring a webinar we did with the Yukon Conservation Society. It's a webinar that's about the Yukon Beringia Priority Place Initiative. Now, it's a webinar from a little while ago, but it's quite interesting all the same, and I think you're going to find the content super relevant even today. That's going to be the first half of today's podcast. The second half is actually going to be dedicated to discussing food security and the environment in the context of the Yukon, but things that you can learn from the example of the Yukon that can be applied pretty much anywhere. And it's drawn a bit from my personal experience. So if you're like my friend Kayla, who told me the other day that they enjoy listening to this podcast because my voice is good to fall asleep to, that second half of the podcast is going to be for you. Anyway, please do enjoy today's podcast. And before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.
Sierra Club offers this webinar as part of our All Hands on Deck series that showcases the diversity of issues and solutions as we come together to deal with the environmental and social challenges of our time. These webinars are free and take place once a month. Today's webinar is being co-presented with the Yukon Conservation Society, and today's presenter is Sebastian Jones. And this webinar is about the Yukon South Beringia Priority Place. Sebastian Jones has been a member of the Dawson Renewable Resources Council and is now Vice Chair of the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board. He has also worked for the Northern Climate Exchange and Tronda-Quitchin First Nation. Sebastian was the Director of the Conservation Klondike Society from 2005 to 2009 and was on the board of Yukon Conservation Society until becoming the Peel Watershed Coordinator in 2011. He then became one of Yukon Conservation Society's energy analysts, commenting on government policy related to energy, oil and gas, and climate change. He is now Yukon Conservation Society's lead on fish, wildlife, and habitat issues, including land use planning, wetlands protection, and land use policies. Sebastian also keeps Yukon Conservation Society's membership informed through writing and media, and he works on mining issues that impact fish and wildlife. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Sebastian to talk about the Yukon Conservation Society and introduce today's subject. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you, Connor. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this All Hands on Deck webinar, and I hope you find this presentation both useful and interesting. As Connor said, my name is Sebastian Jones, and I am the Fish, Wildlife, and Habitat Analyst at the Yukon Conservation Society, and I am speaking to you this evening from my home in the traditional territory of the Tronda-Quitchin. I am a settler born in the United Kingdom, but I've been fortunate enough to have been resident in the territory of the Tronda-Quitchin for most of my life, and that means that I've been a resident of Beringia all of that time. I currently work for the Yukon Conservation Society. The Yukon Conservation Society is over 50 years old, which, as we like to tell people, makes us older than Greenpeace. And we have three main programs: being a mining watchdog, which helps to steer, and also helping to steer our energy future onto a sustainable path, which included playing a lead role in establishing a moratorium on hydraulic fracturing or fracking in the Yukon. I am the conservation analyst, which means that I look after fish, wildlife, lands, and habitats. We also have a communications team and a trail guides program in the summer. We see ourselves as advocates and watchdogs who seek ecosystem well-being in the Yukon and beyond, recognizing that a healthy human society depends upon a healthy ecology. And we do this through conservation education and analysis, including input into public policy and regulatory processes. And one of the processes that we're involved in is the Yukon South Beringia. Okay, so I want to share a few facts about the Yukon for those of you are not from the Yukon, just to help set the stage. It's a pretty big place. It's almost 500,000 square kilometers, which is about a third of the size of the province of Quebec. But its population is still pretty small, and it's mostly concentrated around Whitehorse in the south. There is one community in the Yukon South Beringia area, Dawson City, with about 2,000 people, and that's basically where I live. The population of the Yukon is rapidly growing, and land use planning is currently underway. It's moving from the North Yukon slowly south. Recently finished planning in the Peel watershed area, and now we're planning the Dawson planning region, the Trondikwichin territory, and that is also the area Yukon South Beringia. It is bounded on the west by the Alaskan border, on the north by a mountain range called the Ogilvie Mountains, and along the east and the south by the limits of the last glaciation. So this area, Yukon South Beringia, was not glaciated during the last ice age. And it can be described as the oldest landscape in Canada because it's been around for millions of years, unlike most of the rest of Canada, which was buried under huge sheets of ice. Because of its isolation, if you will, and because of its ancientness, it is quite rich in endemic species that occur nowhere else. One of the more famous Beringian endemics, which are species that only occur in a certain area, and in this case in Beringia. Many rare and hard to find plants are small and retiring, which is why they don't get noticed very easily. But not spike saxifrage. It's tall and conspicuous and even spectacular. It's got big glossy leaves and a flower spike that's up to 1 meter tall. And Yukon South Beringia is the only place in Canada that this plant exists. To a large degree, it's why I'm here today talking about Yukon South Beringia Priority Place Initiative. So I'm going to get into a bit of a personal story here. Like many people who grew up in northern and remote parts of Canada, I escaped getting much in the way of formal academic education. I got much of my training through spending time out on the land, especially with knowledge holders, both professional biologists and Trondikwichin elders. And one summer, probably because I was used to boats and because I'd spent a lot of time on the river, which meant that I could be trusted to navigate the shifting shoals and islands of the Yukon River, I got a summer job working for the Trondikwichin, mapping and documenting traditional used plants. Mostly I worked with elders, but we also had the services of botanists. Anyway, it was during this summer project that we heard that a rare Beringian plant that had only been recorded in Canada once, about a century ago, might have been seen again in the Dawson region. Botanists had been searching for this elusive spiked saxifrage for 100 years without finding it. So when we heard the rumor of this plant and where it might have been found, a bunch of us went there, and with the help of the Canadian Wildlife Service and with the Yukon's Conservation Data Center, we found it and we documented it again. And ironically, I was now one of the very small group of people that had actually seen this plant in its natural environment and was able to recognize it and knew what kind of place it liked to live in. So I got this amazing job the next summer to go look for it in other places the next year. And so this job took me through most of the Yukon River portion of South Beringia. I spent the entire summer walking through the bush, up and down creeks that it was thought to prefer. I was literally being paid to sniff the flowers. And I learned a tremendous amount about the biology of Yukon South Beringia, which through several more kind of obscure steps led to me eventually being hired by Yukon Conservation Society. Once upon a time, this environment was circumpolar, south of the ice sheets all across Europe and Asia. And now there's only a few remnants of it left. And Yukon South Beringia Priority Place Initiative is one of those places. The steppes of Beringia were very, very dry, which is the reason that it was ice-free for so long, because it was too dry for glaciers to form. There was so little snow, even though it was really cold. But the cloudy range of the Tombstone Mountains acted as an oasis in this arid expanse because it caught sufficient precipitation that they actually did glaciate. So up in the high mountains, there were glaciers that moved down into the steppes. And in the summertime, as they melted, they provided a steady source of water in what was otherwise a very dry country. And this nurtured the evolution of many unique plants and animals too. Tombstone Park is currently the only protected area within Yukon South Beringia, and it was created as a provision of the 1998 treaty between Canada, Yukon, and the Trantacwitchin. So that's why South Beringia was chosen as a priority place, because it is home to unique ecosystems, endemic species. The area is currently under land use planning, and a self-governing First Nation has its traditional territory covers most of Yukon South Beringia. So what is a priority place initiative and what does it mean? So to understand this, I want to explain a little bit about how we do species at risk management in Canada. Our conventional system for looking after species at risk is through the Species at Risk Act, or SARA. The conservation, protection, and restoration of species at risk is governed through the Species at Risk Act. It's a national act. Some provinces, but by no means all of them, have their own Species at Risk Act, which was the intention when the National Act was brought in. But the Species at Risk Act doesn't actually directly protect habitat. It does protect species, and if a recovery plan is drawn up for a species that is listed under the Species at Risk Act, critical habitat might be identified, but it's still not protected unless it happens to be federally managed land. And most land in Canada is managed by provinces or territories. So it really fails to protect land, which is one of the reasons why so many of the species that are at risk are still declining, because their habitats can't be looked after. The provinces could protect the habitat, but a lot of the time protecting the habitat would interfere with Canada's traditional extraction-based economy. But no matter how well the provinces and the federal government work together to protect species, it doesn't really address the issue of protecting ecosystems. The Priority Place Initiative is intended to help address this gap. We could almost describe it as an upside down Species at Risk Act because it starts with ecosystems and doesn't focus much on individual species. There are 11 priority places in Canada. Almost all of them are clustered along our southern border because this is the area where most of the ecosystems are at the highest risk of being disturbed, because that's where most of the people and most of the agriculture and most of the industry in Canada takes place. The Yukon South Beringia Priority Place is the only one in the north. Canada and its provincial and territorial partners agreed to take a pan-Canadian approach to transform the species at risk conservation from single species to multi-species and ecosystem approaches. All priority places are developing what we call integrated conservation action plans, which, doesn't matter all that much what it's called, but these action plans will inform and support other initiatives such as the Dawson Regional Land Use Plan, which is underway currently. And it could also help to identify places and ecosystems that need special attention, such as wetlands, in our case, Beringian steppes and riparian areas, things like that. So the Integrated Conservation Action Plan will draw attention to these rare and diverse landscapes, and it will bring science to bear that will be instrumental in making better decisions in environmental assessments. So these are our focuses related to the Priority Place Initiative. The Yukon's approach to conservation and land use planning places Indigenous governance at its heart. In the land use plans for the North Yukon and the Peel watershed, in these planning areas, between 50 and 80% of the land was designated for conservation, for protection. That's a pretty high quantum. Compared to the rest of Canada, which averages 13%, it's quite a lot more. And it is our hope that the Dawson Regional Land Use Plan and its successors and other land use plans in the Yukon will achieve something similar in the Yukon South Beringia. Everything we know about ecology tells us that the key to preserving biodiversity is protecting large areas of connected habitat. And the Yukon South Beringia project will help us identify some of these areas that need special management. So while this project is an initiative of Canada, Yukon government and the Trondheim government are collaborators in the Yukon South Beringia Priority Place, along with other partners such as the Yukon Conservation Society, Yukon University, University of Alberta, and the Wildlife Society of Canada. And we are working towards an integrated conservation action plan. We have regular meetings, mostly online because of the pandemic, but we've been working through this for 2 or 3 years now. And we have actually got several projects that have been funded through this initiative, which include this project here, which is, I'm going to show a short little video here. And this project, one that was initiated by the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. And they are looking at how they can use, or how we can use, the presence of songbirds to measure the cumulative effects, in this case, of placer mining upon the environment.
My 7-year-old asked me the night before we left, and she goes, "Mom, why are you counting birds? Why aren't you counting grizzly bears or moose or caribou or wolves?" And I said to her, "Honey, when you go into the forest, what's the first thing you hear?" And she said, "Birds." Birds tend to tell us a story, and if something's wrong in the forest, the birds go quiet. So the birds almost give us a signal or a warning when something's wrong.
I'm here to do a cumulative effects study on human disturbance and climate change on bird populations and other wildlife populations in the central Yukon. We've been visiting a variety of sites that are kind of aimed to look at the effect of human disturbance and mining and roads on the landscape. So we've been visiting sites that are in intact forests, so they're quite far away from any human activity or disturbance. And then all the way up along the gradient to heavily impacted sites where there's active mining and traffic and highways going through an environment. We do this through the use of point count surveys, so that involves early mornings to get up and kind of count the birds at different areas when they're most active. So that's early in the morning, usually between 5 and 9 a.m.
Birdsong is really like a hard field work. For example, the plants, if you want to know what a plant is really easy because it stays there, so you have plenty of time to look at your book. But bird songs are really dynamics. You don't always see the bird. You don't always hear the complete song of a bird. So it's really kind of a cool game to try to identify the bird without like all the clues that you can have.
I definitely like the blackpoll warbler a little bit. It kind of has this insane migration where it's flying like some ridiculous amount of kilometers in a single trip. It's not stopping over anywhere to refuel. It just takes off from the east coast of America, and it just flies nonstop until it gets to South America. It's just an amazing little expression of endurance.
This morning when we were at a site, we sat down, we had something to eat, and to the east of us, we could hear the active dredging of the mines, and you could hear the hum of the motors and the engines.
Placer mining is gold mining. So gold is deposited basically in low-lying areas, usually in watercourses.
You're kind of scooping up the bed of rivers, and you're running it through a large machine that kind of vibrates the rocks and rushes water over them, and that's meant to knock the gold loose into a pan where you receive it. And then you return that waste rock back to the area that you got it at, and you kind of like just shift the stream over. It's not like a desolate wasteland so much as it's deteriorated habitat. There's still vital areas there, and it's still usable. So of course you're still going to have birds using areas that are heavy in water, because everything needs water. Placer mines need water, and birds need water.
If you look at a single mine, you're not really going to get an idea of the big picture, because there's so many of these little placer mines dotted all across the landscape, and they're all in very critically sensitive ecosystems and environments, that you really have to look at all of these mines as a whole instead of just each mine separately.
I think that birds kind of give us a unique vantage point that you don't get with other larger, maybe like bears or moose, in the respect that they're traveling great distances to come up this way. If they're coming all this way to utilize habitat that's up here, and it's not there for them, they don't really have a lot of other options. They've flown thousands of kilometers to get here, and they can't exactly just turn around and go back.
So the science question really is, how many effects can an ecosystem sustain and remain healthy? Ultimately, we're out here learning how we can reduce our impacts on the natural world so that we can continue to hear the birds sing.
Anyway, this is one of the projects that's been taking place in Yukon South Beringia has been a bioblitz.
Oh, no. So bioblitzes are multi-species, community-driven, community-involved, people from all over getting involved. And so it was a really obvious project for the Priority Place Initiative to sponsor this bioblitz here at Beaver Creek, which is at the southern tip of Yukon South Beringia.
Unique to Canada and perhaps in the world. So it's a tremendously interesting area. And also it's one that's not usually visited by specialists.
The BioBlitz is a biological inventory. We are looking for as many different species as we can. The neighbors, the denizens of the communities, they're coming to us and exposing themselves for us. But when the wildlife comes running up to you and says, hey, that's very special. But a huge part of it is a social interaction and networking to engage the youth, especially people who already have an interest, get them to meet with people who've spent their lives studying these groups and passing that knowledge on, and try and capture a little of the magic that develops when you get like-minded people together. Let's get out on the land and let's share stories. People only conserve what they care about, and they'll only care about things once they know about it, and they'll only know about it once somebody finds it.
And there's a couple other videos on the Yukon South Beringia Priority Place Initiative website that are worth checking out as well. So our role, the Yukon Conservation Society, we don't have biologists and botanists typically working in the field on projects, but we have nonetheless been deeply involved in conservation planning in the Dawson region and with many other initiatives across the Yukon. And we typically focus on direct engagement with governments and with interaction with the public. And when we started participating with the Yukon South Beringia project, that we soon identified a need to communicate what the Yukon South Beringia Priority Place Initiative is and why it's important to conservation in the Yukon. And this presentation this evening is part of that communication. And I hope that I've helped to communicate this and that you too now have a bit more of an appreciation for this special place. I do want to acknowledge the hard work and enthusiastic support of Environment and Climate Change Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service. Their leadership and resources have been extraordinary, and absolutely instrumental to this process. So to learn more and see more videos, please do go check out Yukon South Beringia, all one word, yukonsouthberingia.ca.
Hi everyone, Conor Curtis, Head of Communications, jumping back in here to do the Q&A for today's episode. And I thought that because this is a bit of a different episode on our podcast than we normally do, it would also be an interesting time to do, once again, a bit of a different Q&A than we normally do on the podcast. And I wanted to touch on an issue that is very dear to my heart and that is very dear to a lot of people's hearts, and that has a connection actually to the Yukon, because this episode is so much focused on Yukon environmental issues, and that's food security. And particularly because of climate change, this is an issue that's coming up a lot, and we're seeing a lot of people ask questions about it, and we're seeing a lot of people worried because they are aware that a lot of our food systems are highly interdependent upon each other. And so if you have a sudden decline in productivity of food in one place, or there's a climate issue, or there's even trade issues that prevent food from being exported to other countries. In Canada, we're often highly dependent in certain places for food that is at least transported a fair distance in order to get to us. Then those disruptions to those supply chains could potentially have devastating consequences. And I think that it's particularly true of places that already have difficulty getting enough food in. And I'm thinking here about the territories. I'm thinking about places like Newfoundland and Labrador, places that are often on the end of that chain of food distribution. The reason why this particular issue is so near and dear to my heart is because I used to live in the Yukon, and I lived there for 2 years during COVID. And actually, my job while I was there for the better part of that time was as a manager at a food bank, and particularly a manager of community services. So my job was to schedule food shipments to different communities throughout the Yukon, to basically manage the creation of hampers for those communities, and to manage food distribution at the front and the volunteer aspect of that particular food bank. And this was an extremely challenging situation. It was, of course, during COVID, which made already this task quite difficult. But then, you had very large territory, as you heard about in the webinar recording we just played. A lot of communities spread out very distantly from each other, a lot of different social dynamics in each community, and a lot of different things and factors that you had to account for, as well as just volunteering, right? How do you have enough volunteers on the ground to actually distribute food? I think these are issues that we're going to deal with more and more as climate change continues to get worse, as we see disruptions to food chains, as we see disruptions to biodiversity. And so I wanted to chat about some potential solutions and good places to start. Maybe not so much solutions, but good places to start in preparing for that and in building those mutual networks of food interdependence and interreliability. And the first thing that I think you want to touch on is that there's no real future in Canada which we're not going to have to import some food, no matter how self-sustaining we become. And we've talked about this on the show before when we talked with local collective garden in Montreal that operates around a collective food system. Those things are really valuable. They can offset actually a lot of the food demand in an area, much more than you probably think, even by a small garden. But there's no way that we ever get to a point where those things alone provide all of the food that we get. Partially, this is just due to demand. There will always be demand for food items that we can't grow in Canada. Things, especially like coffee. If you drink coffee, this is probably something you're very afraid of if you know anything about climate change, because climate can have a huge impact on coffee production. Things like chocolate, lots of those items that maybe we don't think of as direct necessities, but which I think you do want to think about as necessities. Because one thing I did learn working at that food bank is that basically relying upon just the bare nutritional requirements is not really enough for people. And it's the way I think most people would enter into the notion of food security without maybe taking the next step and thinking, well, food is not just about security. It's not just about eating the same thing over and over again, provided it provides nutritional supplement. It's a lot more to people. It's a part of culture. It's a part of enjoyment. It's something that breaks with the mundanity of life and allows you to actually live through things from a mental health perspective. My grandmother used to call food the ultimate art form because it engages all of the different senses. And even if you're a struggling parent who can't really afford to feed their children very well, you still probably want to get, more than anything, sometimes things that are a little bit enjoyable, that are different, that are going to provide your kids with something different to eat. Because that role, that job of being a parent is already difficult enough with seeing your kids eat the same thing every day. Do we consider that to be enough if we're talking about sustaining people? And I don't think that we should. And part of that comes down to having more resilient food systems in place locally, but part of it is just acknowledging the fact that we are always going to be a bit interdependent on food. And so one thing I do want to address right out the gate is that while I'm mostly going to talk here about improving localized food security, the other thing I want to chat about is not treating it as a substitute for everything, because there is always going to be some interreliance. And I think that that's important, and that we actually try to foster that in a healthy way with other places. And there are initiatives, of course, around that, things like fair trade, things that seek to provide people, the producers on one end of the food system, with what they need in a fair way for what we actually take out of it. Another thing that we want to just think about in that regard is making sure that we do have good interconnections with food producing places, making sure that we're taking preventative measures to lessen the impacts of climate change in the future, because we are not going to get, again, we've talked about this in regards to climate change in multiple different ways. We're never going to get to a point at which adaptation is enough. So if you're thinking about the food crisis as something that you are going to have to deal with in the future as a result of climate change, don't just think of it in terms of adaptation. What I mean by that is, don't just think of it in terms of, well, how do we grow more stuff here if a food system collapses somewhere else that we're reliant upon? Think about it in terms of prevention, because, again, there is no way, as with any other aspect of this issue, that we adapt enough to offset the damage, right? We need to prevent before we adapt. So everything I say here from this point on should be understood in that context, that still prevention is the most important thing. But on that adaptation side, how do you put in place better food systems? We've had a great podcast episode again about collective gardening and the power that can have to produce a supplement to food in an area, and actually enjoyable food, different foods for an area, for people, fresh vegetables, for instance, high nutritional value things. That's really a project that almost anybody could take on in almost any place in Canada. I mean, this was happening in the Yukon. Not so much collective gardening, but again, gardening for food purposes. It's a place you might not think about doing that, but it's a place where it can be done. And so one of the key things that I would encourage anybody here worried about food systems to get involved with is either some sort of community gardening project or some sort of collective gardening project that actually is focused upon producing a significant amount of food. And I think that's probably one of the things that I would say is a trade-off, right? You do want to think about how much energy you're putting into that project compared to actually how much food you're getting out of it. But it is 100% possible to have things that help supplement the dietary restrictions, the dietary input that you have in a given community, and that's something to get involved with. And a side benefit of that, and another thing to prioritize in doing that, is skill building, right? Building the skills to actually go out and garden yourself, whether that's growing a few things in your own place or on your own balcony or wherever you can, but also just passing those skills on. Because in a resilience situation where maybe food becomes a problem, or in a situation where there's a problem with, maybe you've built up that food security, you have gardens, but something goes wrong, the more people share relevant skills on being able to grow and create their own food, maybe even skills about like foraging, other sorts of skills around that, right? The more people who share and actually know those skills, the more resilient the overall system is, the more problem solving becomes a lot easier. Another thing that I think is just having reinforced supply chains. So we saw this in the Yukon actually, when at one point there was a wildfire threatening one of the main paths that we use to transport food up into the Yukon. And at that point, there really was a risk that, we could be cut off for a long period of time from being able to get food in. And because there's just kind of like only a couple of options in terms of roads to actually get that food into the Yukon, that was a major transport route that wasn't necessarily possible to use. And so I think when we're talking about localizing food dependency, we also want to talk about interdependency. A good analogy for this is something we talked about in the renewable energy episode that we did a while back, where we chatted about it's not just building up renewable energy locally. It's also having grids that are interconnected to other grids, where we can transfer energy. If the wind is blowing in one place, a distance to another place where maybe it isn't blowing that day. It's having things like battery storage. There's an analogy here to food systems where you build up local capacity as much as possible, but you don't treat that as your only fallback. You still have multiple interconnectedness to other people who are producing food, whether that's in your area, whether that's very far afield. But you have that built up interconnectedness as well as the local resilience. That's when you can actually have a really robust food system that is going to be able to withstand a lot of the things out there that can go wrong. Maybe you do lose a significant amount of farming land in a place like California that knocks our supply chains for food really off balance, and we have to try to make up for that. Well, that's going to be a lot easier to deal with if we not only have that local food supply, but also have, again, connections to other places that are producing their own food that maybe have a surplus one year when another place doesn't have that same surplus. So ask people to break maybe with the survivalist image that they might have had in their minds of, well, I'll just grow all my own food for myself and that will be it. Well, things happen. Crops fail. There's lots of other things that can go wrong. The more redundancies and backups you have, the more ability you have to not necessarily be dependent upon other people, but to have interconnections with other people who are growing food, the better off you're going to be. That includes things like having lots of different supply lines into a place. I think for anywhere that's rural, thinking about that is really important. And thinking about that beyond just, well, we have a road, right? I can tell you this as somebody whose job it was at one point to organize food shipments. It's not just having the road, it's having the people to actually transport the food, to hand it out, to distribute it. Thinking about the fairness of the distribution, right? Like, how is that going to happen in a community versus how is that going to happen in a city versus whatever factor you want to put in there. There's always going to be issues of fairness that are going to crop up. Practicing that now, having those mutual support networks in place now is going to be really, really key if something goes wrong with food systems, because the more you build up those interconnectedness, the more you build up that way of thinking about things. Well, great, but you have to have those foundational things there too. Volunteers, people working in this area, ideally, people whose job it is to actually figure out how to get food to people. Those jobs become really important in a crisis, and those jobs become really key. And the more we practice that ahead of time, rather than treating it as something that will institute the moment there's a food crisis, the more important it is. So that's an example of something that, comes from the Yukon that I think is very more and more applicable as we start to deal with environmental crises of our time. I think another thing to think about is how do people perceive, again, things like food bank use, right? For a lot of people in this country, the idea of suddenly having to go to the food bank to support themselves is scary. And this is something you can see when people come to a food bank. A lot of people, especially people who had families, maybe they lost their job, they're used to being providers, and now suddenly they feel reliant upon somebody else. It's heart-wrenching for people. It's very difficult for them to deal with. And psychologically, that's a whole nother thing that we have to deal with in the society too. We have this emphasis on people having to be the provider. Well, that's not always possible. And we have to acknowledge that that's not always possible for people to just provide for themselves. And again, those mutual support networks, if they're built into society ahead of time before a crisis happens, well, that makes it a lot easier for people to feel like those things are open to them when the crisis happens. It makes it a lot easier for people to work together when a crisis happens, as opposed to fighting each other over who grabs the last toilet paper from the aisle. These are factors that you want to think about, psychological factors that you want to think about, that are super important when we chat about food in this context. And again, we will be seeing more impacts. We will be seeing impacts, I think, to food security that are going to be quite severe. It's not to sugarcoat any of that, but it is to say that there are ways that we can start planning now for a future that will be difficult, that make things a lot easier down the line. There are things, again, that we can do to mitigate the future impacts of climate change that will make food systems much more easy to sustain. It's a bit of a diverge from today's podcast episode in the sense of we've been chatting about biodiversity in a very different way. But again, those things tie in. When we chat about biodiversity, it's important to remember these places are places people live, right? These aren't just abandoned places. People have lived in these areas for thousands of years. They've relied upon the land for thousands of years. When we chat about climate change and we talk about the traditional practices, particularly in northern Canada, and how important those are and how much those are affected by climate change and how much traditional food items are affected by climate change, there's two aspects to that. On one hand, yes, climate change is a severe threat to a lot of those traditional practices. On the other hand, there's a lot we can learn from those traditional practices that we should be applying to our own lives in terms of food security, in terms of thinking about food, in terms of appreciating the environment that we have and actually interacting with it in a way that is healthy, in a way that's sustainable. One thing that came up in the episode that we did about community and collective gardening was that in the context of Newfoundland and Labrador, a lot of people used to grow their own food, grow their own vegetables, maybe not all of it, but a portion of it throughout the year. And that actually became less and less common, in part because of this move towards a consumerist mentality. It became a class status issue if you're growing your own food. And that actually discouraged people from doing something that was quite sustainable, that was quite important from a food sustainability standpoint. And that, quite frankly, is the sort of thing now most people who are into that kind of thing are doing in big cities or trying to do, or has become, in a weird way, fashionable again. It's important to understand that these things are not just rooted in practice. They're rooted in culture and they're rooted in tradition. And finding ways to encourage that, finding ways to look at these things as not something that's brand new, not looking at sustainability in a community or food sustainability, in particular in a community, as some brand new concept, but actually looking at how it's already being done and building upon that, that's a big part of the solution as well. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates that you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hoppinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick, on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.